This tape contains the national finals debate in the 1966 National Speech Tournament held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The team upholding the affirmative in this debate is from Edmond High School, Toledo, Ohio. They were coached by Mrs. Esther Kalmbach. The debaters are Lynn Fever and Donald Anthony. Upholding the negative in this debate, the team from Edmond, Oklahoma. Coached by Mr. Jack Shaw, the debaters are Richard Bernard and Brad Rice. The 1966 championship round in debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this, the final round of the 1966 National Debate Tournament, Don and I are pleased to be debating the affirmative side of the proposition, resolved that the federal government should adopt the program of compulsory arbitration of labor management disputes in the basic industries. Now, in order to avoid any conceivable misunderstandings of the terms of the proposition, we provide the following definitions. By compulsory arbitration, we would mean the mandatory submission of labor management disputes to settlement by a third party, and basic industries would be those industries whose function is vital to the well-being of the American economy. Having clarified the terms of the proposition, then, let's see exactly why Don and I would advocate its adoption. We would say, first of all, that there is a definite need for changing from the present system of labor management relations, and secondly, that the adoption of the affirmative program would in fact resolve this need. Turning our attention back to that first contention, that there's a definite need for changing from the present system. We're basing this contention on three indictments of our present system of labor management relations. First of all, that it's ineffective in principle. Secondly, that it's faulty in structure. And third and finally, that the present system represents a failure in its application. Going back to that first indictment, that the status quo is ineffective in principle. Now, initially, let's establish just what the underlying principle of the present system is. Quite simply, it's that labor and management today should negotiate all contract terms and grievances through a system of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining, by its basic principle, requires that these negotiations be carried out in a relatively balanced atmosphere. That is, a situation where both labor and management have relatively equal bargaining strength. Today, in the basic industries, this situation simply does not exist, and as such, the status quo is ineffective in principle. From U.S. News and World Report of November 15, 1965, we find, this is the kind of collective bargaining envisioned by the Congress in the 1930s when it enacted the Wagner Act, presumably to establish a balance of bargaining strength between union and employer and to encourage truly collective bargaining. Unhappily, this is not what emerged. Now, regardless of which side possesses this excess of bargaining strength, the situation is still one of imbalance. As Milton Gerber, professor of industrial relations at the University of Illinois, pointed out, I don't think anyone can truthfully say that bargaining strength between union and employer is universally balanced. In almost all industries, the scales are tipped to one side or the other. Thus, we've demonstrated that the basic principle of collective bargaining requires a relative balance, and secondly, that this needed balance simply does not exist. The status quo is ineffective in principle. Turning then to that second indictment of the present system, that is faulty in structure. Here, Don and I would indict the existing multiplicity of labor legislation and procedures that currently plague labor management relations. Fully acknowledging that the government does have a distinct responsibility for the regulation and enhancement of labor management affairs, we would seriously question on several counts the present framework through which this responsibility has allegedly been shouldered. We would say, first of all, that selective government enforcement of present policies seriously infringes on the rights of our citizens. A classic example of this can be found in the application of the presidential wage price guidelines. Unions, time and again, have exceeded the 3.2% wage increase figure set forward by the administration with no action other than a mild verbal reprimand on the part of the government. On the other side of the ledger, however, when management has ultimately been forced to raise their prices, the government has clamped down with stringent sanctions, denial of valuable contracts, and release of government stockpiles. Second of all, we would say that unregulated government intervention has significantly entangled labor and management in political considerations. As James L. McGugan, an assistant professor of management at Duquesne University, pointed out in Labor Law Journal of June 1963, it is utter folly to expect that a man who holds an elective office can ignore the demands of his supporters, whether they be labor or management, and arrive at an impartial solution. To resulted in a wasteful duplication and overlapping of services. We turn to our own Secretary of Labor, W. Willard Wirtz, in an address to the National Academy of Arbitrators, where he stated, settlement of the last round of contract disputes in the airlines industry took over 2 years, involved the President of the United States, the Secretary of Labor, the Undersecretary of Labor, the National Mediation Board, the Special Presidential Commission, 9 Presidential Emergency Board, and 3 boards of arbitration, a total of 39 public representatives. And he went on to state, this obviously is not a wholly satisfactory nor an efficient government procedure. Thus, in demonstrating that the status quo is faulty in structure, we've seen 3 specific problems. Selective enforcement of present policies infringing on the rights of our citizens, unregulated government intervention entangling labor and management of political affairs, and finally, the lack of a consistent national labor policy resulting in a wasteful duplication and overlapping of services. Each one of these problems and deficiencies points to that much more serious indictment. The status quo is faulty in structure. Let's turn our attention then to that third and final indictment of the present system, that it represents a failure in its application. Defects in principle and structure of the present system have resulted in concrete problems and harms when applied in actual use. Let's examine the application of the status quo in 2 aspects. The first of these, its effect on labor, and second, its effect on management and the related economy. First of all, its effect on labor. In the past, one of labor's prime sources of bargaining strength has been the threat and sometimes the use of the strike. However, an increasing automation in many basic industries today has substantially cut back on the effectiveness of that strike. As Philip Harris, an associate professor of business administration at the University of New York, pointed out, chemicals, petroleum, and utilities are some of the industries where management has been able to continue operations in spite of a work stoppage. Now, the end result of this decline of the value of the strike as far as labor is concerned has resulted in the fact that labor's wage gains in these automated industries have substantially slowed in recent years, while the profits of management have climbed consistently. The failure in application of the status quo has also resulted in problems to management and the related economy, our second area of analysis. In the past few years, for an example, we've witnessed a rash of strikes in the basic industries. In late 64, we had an auto strike. In early 65, a dock strike. In the summer of 1965, a maritime strike. 1966 began with a transit strike in New York City, and in April of 1966, a railroad strike. President Johnson, referring to that dock strike, told us to use his words that the losses were of staggering proportions. And an official of the Industry and Commerce Association of New York City, speaking of the transit strike, said, the city's economy was struck harder at this time than at any time since the Great Depression. Strikes hit hard, not only the industry directly struck, but as these authorities point out, carry severe repercussions to the directly related economy. Penetrating even deeper, however, into the application of the status quo, we can find that in those instances of labor's advantage, settlements containing excessive wage increases and fringe benefits, make work rules, and feather bedding have substantially slowed the profit margins of management and many of these non-automated industries, and once again have carried a severe effect to the directly related economic expansion. In both instances, however, whether it's management or labor which possesses this excess of bargaining strength, the situation and the results confirm the affirmative position that the status quo does represent a failure in its application. We've demonstrated then 3 specific indictments of the status quo. It is, first of all, ineffective in principle, secondly, faulty in structure, and third and finally represents a failure in its application. It is for these reasons that Don and I are contending that there is a definite need for changing from this present system of labor management relations. Thank you.
Within the text of the Wagner Act, does it ever say that we are trying to establish a balance of power in every industry or only a balance of power?
I believe it points out, as U.S. News did, that it was intended to establish a balance of power between labor and management.
Did it ever say in every industry? Did it ever say in any one industry?
I'm not sure that it specified any industries or any group of industries.
Therefore, may we conclude that its purpose was an overall balance of power?
A balance of power between labor and management, as U.S. News and World Report.
Very fine. Who holds the balance of power in the basic steel industry?
In steel, the balance is relatively resting on the side of labor at this point.
You can prove that.
No, certainly can.
And you will in your next speech.
I will in my speech. Don will be happy to in his speech.
Who holds the balance of power in the automobile industry?
Once again, the situation, the results confirm the fact that the labor, once again, has the balance.
And you will prove that in your next speech.
I could, or Don will.
All right, fine. Now, you talked about the faulty structure of collective bargaining. Is it necessary to enforce things when the law is not violated?
Well, if there's a law that's not violated, then obviously it wouldn't necessarily require any enforcement.
Have the wage post guidelines been violated?
The wage price guidelines have been violated in many instances.
Now, we know that when labor signs a contract, the first-year wage increase is much larger than the second and third-year wage increases. With a consideration, therefore, to the whole contract, have the wage post guidelines been violated?
Well, I would point out, first of all, that basic idea that the initial wage increase is larger is not true in all instances. We'd point out in many
But now, wait a second. We've already determined we're talking about overall. Is it true in overall instances?
Well, I believe when you take into account the overall period of the contract, the labor wage price guidelines have been violated by the unions.
You said political ramifications occur. What do you mean by political?
Well, we never stated anything about political
You said political involvement then. Maybe that was the word. What do you mean by political?
Well, the fact that labor and management, due to this idea that government can and often does intervene in the labor management situation, are compelled.
Government intervention then is politically bad.
We pointed out that due to the fact
that compulsory arbitration, government intervention.
Compulsory arbitration, as under the affirmative plan, is the government enacting a program of compulsory arbitration and not specifically solving the dispute as it is under the status quo.
Could you give me some examples of where this was bad?
Which was bad?
Political intervention.
Well, it's bad in every instance that you have.
Name me one.
The steel settlement in 1965. I'd be happy to.
All right, would you do so in your next speech, please? Now let's talk about then the failure in the application. You said that labor was weak in the chemical, oil, and utility industries, correct?
That was Philip Harris, a professor of business administration.
And you are aware, of course, that they have just received settlements for wage increases above the national average.
Pardon?
You are aware, of course, that their wage increases are above the national average.
I don't believe their wage increases in any instance are above the national average.
All right, under management, you talked about strike harm. In analyzing the affirmative contentions in this discussion, my colleague and I are going to be working from two basic negative attacks. Initially, we're going to contend that the status quo is quite adequate in principle because it does what it sets out to do. Secondly, then, we're going to accuse the affirmative of being guilty of a synecdoche. A synecdoche is simply this. It's looking at one part of a situation and finding that because something holds true for that one part, it should correspondingly, therefore, hold true for the entire situation. What Brad and I are going to attempt to do, however, is to look to the entire situation. Now, with these attacks in mind, let us review the affirmative case. The affirmative team told you, first of all, that at the present time, we have an ineffective status quo because of principle. They said, in principle, collective bargaining is bad. Now, remember, let's turn back to the Wagner Act and turn back even further, I might say, to the cross-examination period. We discovered in the cross-examination period that the purpose of the Wagner Act was to provide a balance of power. Yes, but a balance of power overall, not a balance of power in each and every specific case between labor and management. Now, therefore, the question becomes, is the Wagner Act being fulfilled today, and is there a balance of power overall? Former Secretary of Labor Arthur J. Goldberg has the answer for us. As he states, does nationwide or regional or pattern bargaining give too much power to labor? I think the question is an unqualified no. There is no evidence in any major industry that the financial strength of the bargaining power of a union is larger than the financial strength or bargaining power of the employers. Definitely then, overall, we cannot draw the conclusion that there is an imbalance of power either way. Therefore, since the Wagner Act set out to establish an overall balance, it has done that. In principle, it is effective. Turning to the second affirmative need for a change then. They talked about the faulty structure of collective bargaining. They said it was faulty for three reasons. Initially, they said, you have not enforced the wage guideposts. Now, in looking to this in the cross-examination period, I asked the question, if there is no violation, need there be enforcement? He said, no, of course not. Ladies and gentlemen, there has been no overall violation. According to United Press International of November the 25th of 1966, Commissioner Arthur M. Ross of the Bureau of Labor Statistics said that this indicated the 1% excess was not necessarily valid. He said that figures were inflated to an unusual degree by long-term settlements. Now, this is the entire picture I told you about in some industries, which provided abnormally big pay hikes the first year with lesser increases following. Now, in other words, if you look to the affirmative first year of a multi-year contract, you would find them to be correct and the wage post guidelines to be violated. However, if you look to the entire life of the contract, you will find that because there are smaller increases in secondary years, that the wage post guidelines have not been violated. The Associated Press goes on to state, but the Bureau says that the wage increases averaged out over the length of the contract, some running 2 or 3 years ahead. The gains are within the guidelines, since the first year pay boost is usually larger than the later one. Definitely then there has been no violation, and correspondingly then there is no need for enforcement. The second affirmative point, they said political intervention was bad. Herein I asked them for examples, and they said they would bring that up on their next stand. Therefore, debate on this point is going to have to wait until the affirmative team can prove their contention. The third affirmative point, here was an overlapping of government agencies. They said you use mediation, conciliation, fact-finding, arbitration, all of these combined. They said here you're overlapping, and you're therefore wasting your time. Ladies and gentlemen, instead of taking the defensive on this point, my colleague and I choose to take the offensive. The offensive for this reason. We feel it is good there are all these measures provided because this allows flexibility within our system. If you need mediation, the affirmative team says compulsory arbitrate. If you need fact-finding, the affirmative team says compulsory arbitrate. If you need conciliation, the affirmative team would compulsory arbitrate. Ladies and gentlemen, we have at the present time a flexible system, and a flexible system is good because it can take care of the problem where the problem exists. Let's now go into the third affirmative contention. The third affirmative contention existed within the application of collective bargaining. They say there is a failure of application. Herein they said in certain industries, labor is weak because of automation, and labor is therefore going to be hurt. Let's remember two of their basic examples, chemical and oil workers. Let's see if the wage increases of those industries were low. Chemical Week of October the 23rd of 1965 points out, petroleum refiners and oil and chemical and atomic workers generally agreed on a 4.5 wage increase. Now, a 4.5 wage increase doesn't mean much, unless you realize that overall contracts increased last year by only 3.8%. Therefore, in these automated industries where the wage increases are supposed to be lower, ladies and gentlemen, they were higher than the national average. But now taking it a step further then, the affirmative team then looked secondarily into management. And they said management is going to be harmed. That management is going to be harmed because of the strike situation. Now in looking to this situation, again we're going to accuse the affirmative team of being guilty of a synecdoche. This time a synecdoche of time sequence. Failure to examine the entire time of the strike. Now we feel that you have to examine 3 periods within the strike. A pre-strike preparation period, the strike itself, and a post-strike makeup period for any losses that might have occurred. Now, in an analysis of all 3 of these, we're going to find that losses were made up. Now, because I'm not going to have enough time to handle each and every one of the strikes, let's take one of their examples. Survey of current business in December of 65 points out. The longshoreman strike last winter resulted in major shifts of shipments during the first and second quarter of 65, and to some extent the last quarter of 64. There was a longshoreman strike which occurred, a longshoreman strike which was made up to increased activity afterwards. An analysis of the whole picture therefore indicates that the strike loss was definitely made up, and the only loss you could even talk about was merely delayed gains. But taking it a step further, the affirmative team then said that perhaps wages are going to go up too fast in some industries. Wages are going to go up faster than profits. Ladies and gentlemen, herein we do not feel that this is a fair analysis. Now, to compare labor's gains against management's gains, you have to take into consideration their cost. For labor, the cost is the cost of living. This chart from the combined Department of Commerce and Labor tells us in the black line here is cost of living, and the red line here is wage increases, per capita income. In other words, workers are going up fast, their incomes rather, are going up faster than the cost of living. All right, they're in good shape. That's the only thing you have to compare workers' gains to. But when you compare management's gains, management's profits, you have to take into consideration expansion, automation, reinvestment in your own company, secondary investment in other companies, advertising, and dividends. 6 other criteria which have to come out of management's profits. Now, to therefore say that profits have not gone up as fast as wages is not a fair analysis unless you can actually take out what the expenditures have to be for. And in one final word, I would like to say in relation to the automobile industry. They told you that automobile industry's profits were low. Ladies and gentlemen, their profit margin for 1965 stood at 10.3%, one of the very highest on the entire chart of industrial production provided for us by Business Week magazine. For this reason, we do not feel that the United States should adopt compulsory arbitration. Thank you.
No, in relation to that Business Week magazine you just referred to, what was the date on that, please?
February the 5th of 1966.
And was it speaking of margins or profits in dollars and cents?
Margins of profits and percentage of gain.
It was speaking of percentage gains as far as dollars are concerned or margins are concerned?
Would you like to examine the entire article?
No, if you just tell me what it says, please.
It says that percentage of gain was 10.3% for the automobiles.
All right, and this is speaking, as I can see now, of the dollar value. Is this correct?
Well, the dollar value, in the sense that that's what profits are, and that's what you're
talking
talking
about. All right, now I
about.
believe you were talking about profit margins. You said profit margins declined by 10%. Is this correct?
Yes, that's what the quotation said.
That's speaking of margins, sir?
Yes, it is. It's right here under the column and labeled Profit Margins 1965. Right here at 10%.
Sir, in relation to this conclusion you drew, you said that we couldn't prove that there was an overall balance either way. Is this correct?
That is correct.
All right, now would you please reread that evidence to allegedly prove that?
The evidence I read said that labor could not be shown to have hold the overall balance anywhere. All right. Does nationwide or regional or pattern bargaining give too much power to labor? I think the answer to the question is an unqualified no. There is no evidence that any major industry, the financial strength or the bargaining power of a union is larger than the financial strength or bargaining power of the employer.
All right, does that say anything at all about whether management's bargaining power could conceivably be larger than labor's?
I think we might say at this point that I have proven that labor does not hold the upper hand overall.
All right, fine. How about management, sir? I believe
would you like me to finish my answer?
I'd rather you just answer the initial question.
Well, I am answering the initial question.
Well, maybe we'd better move on then. I believe you told us that we had a flexible system today and that this was good. Is this correct?
Yes.
All right, now do you have any sources to back up your opinion, sir?
Yes, we do.
Could you please tell me who they might be?
We can present them in our next stand if you feel it's that necessary.
No, if you'd like to present one right now, that's quite all right.
I believe I'd rather wait till our next stand. Thank you. The reason is simple. I don't know the names of the sources right offhand. I'll have to look them up.
That's quite all right. I believe you told us that there were 6 criteria that you had to take into account as far as profits are concerned. Is this correct?
Yes, there are.
All right. Now, one of them was advertising, wasn't it?
Yes.
All right. Now, is advertising considered something that's taken out of profits, or is that one of the costs of business?
That is something that is taken out of profit.
Can you prove that, sir?
Yes, again, if you feel it's necessary.
I presume then you can prove
once again, I might point out that the burden of proof should lie with the affirmative team here, because they have never shown that it is unjust to when you compare profits against the rise in wage costs.
Okay, fine. I believe you referred to a chart here that's speaking of the cost of living. Could you please tell me what the date on that chart was?
March the 28th of 1966.
Okay, fine. I see our time is up. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as second speaker for the affirmative team in today's debate, I'd first of all like to review those areas of need Lynn cited in his first speech and view them in light of negative comment. Recall that first indictment that the present system is ineffective in principle. Here Lynn established in that very first speech that the present system requires a relative balance of bargaining strength between the two parties. Now, as he pointed out, the Wagner Act never said specifically that it had to be in each industry. That wasn't our point. The point is that it should be in each specific industry. Now, not that the Wagner Act didn't specify it, nor did it say that it shouldn't be. Now, the conclusion of the last speaker is that there's no overall balance in either favor of labor or management. That's not the point. As Lynn proved in the very first speech from Milton Derber, in each and every industry, the scales are tipped to one side or the other. And Bernard H. Jensen points out in Industrial and Labor Relations Review, July 1963, the logical reason why this holds true. Any situation in which one party has the power to arbitrarily impose its will upon the other is not a situation in which bargaining can take place. Power to paralyze is alien to the collective bargaining process. Simply looking at it logically shows that first indictment, and that is that the system is ineffective in principle, rests with the affirmative team. All right, let's go to that second indictment, and that is the present system is faulty in structure. Here he indicted the existing multiplicity of labor legislation and procedures, and at no time was there a negative stand on such. Well, let's look at the results where we did have some comment from the negative team. In that first area, that selective government enforcement infringes on the rights of our citizens. He said here, you were talking about the wage price guidelines, and if you look at the long-term situation, you'll find that they really didn't violate them. That was a nice assertion, but once again, he didn't give you any specifics. It was from U.S. News and World Report, January 17th, 1966. It points out that the auto workers received a 5% increase each year over the next 3 years. Carpenters and cement masons averaging about 6% per year. Aluminum, a pay base of more than 4% a year. It was a direct violation. But let's carry the indictment a little further, as Lynn did in his first speech. Each of these instances of violation went without government reprimand. However, when aluminum prices, for example, attempted to increase their prices, the government stepped in with distinct sanctions. It is an infringement of our rights, and that is the point the affirmative team was making in today's debate, never denied by the negative. In that second area, that unregulated government intervention entangles labor management affairs with political considerations. They simply wanted the fact that this is occurring today. Ferguson magazine, January 21st, 1963, tells us, the administration, knowing where the votes lie, has a deft way of selecting staunch friends of labor as fact finders. All right, there's the evidence that that problem's occurring today. And what about that third and final area? That is the present system, because there is a lack of a consistent national policy, has caused an excessive overlapping and duplication of effort. What was the comment here? Well, we feel it's good. With a nice assertion on the part of the negative team, in contrast to our own Secretary of Labor's opinion that it's a wholly unsatisfactory and inefficient procedure. I think the evidence puts the point on the side of the affirmative ledger. All right, so we've seen that the results of these problems do indeed represent a need for a change. Let's turn to that third and final area, and that is that the present system represents a failure in its application. First of all, a harm to labor. And you know, we found one of the most interesting contradictions in the negative case today. He said, look at the increase in the first year of those various automated industries. It's 4.5%. Yet he just told us that we had to compare it over every year. He didn't in the first speech. We'd like to see it in the next speech. But let's graphically illustrate exactly what Lynn and I are telling you in today's debate. Statistics from the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor indicate that in those industries of high automation, the red line emphasizing profits and the green line, wage increases, shows that profit increases in every one of the industries is far exceeding wage increases. Note particularly petroleum. Profit increases over the last few years have been rapidly accelerating, while wage increases have been declining. Now, it was the assertion of the last speaker that we can't use this comparison. Lynn and I feel that we definitely can for one very good reason. Simply, profits represent the ability of management to prosper from their industry, while wages represent the amount of prosperity labor's getting. As these statistics indicate, labor is not getting its fair share. To further emphasize our point, Benjamin S. Kirsch in Automation and Collective Bargaining tells us, when there is an overbalance of strength on the employer's side, the result has been to coerce the workers to accept low wages. All right, what about that second level of analysis? That is the harm to management and the related economy in the non-automated industries. And here, once again, we find a distinct fallacy on the part of the negative team. They said, well, the losses were made up. All the quotation said, however, was that trade had been shifted. The fact remains that many of those losses were not made up. An Associated Press release, February 13th, tells us from a key figure in the shipping industry that dock strike was the cause of irreparable damage to the nation's economy. Business Week magazine, January 22nd, 1966, cited $750 million of permanent loss. Those figures were not denied by the negative team. But then we come around to that second level, and that is where labor has gained excessive wage increases, we're going to find a decline in profit margins. Once again, to illustrate graphically the point of the affirmative team in today's debate, I turn you to a chart provided to us from the Federal Trade Commission, which indicates in those industries where labor has the advantage, the non-automated industries, that profit margins are distinctly on the decline. Now, one industry is not up there, automobiles, which was asked for by the last speaker. United States News and World Report, June 27th, 1966, points out that largely offsetting such gains in profits have been declines in profit margins for motor vehicles, iron and steel, and textiles. All right, once again, answering the challenge of the negative team. And in conclusion on this point, David Lawrence, April 6, 1966, citing these very same statistics, tells us, as long as labor costs can be increased arbitrarily without regard to their impact on the rate of return to the investor, the whole free enterprise system in the United States remains in danger. All right, then, what about a change from the present system? Lynn and I feel that the federal government should enact into law the following requirements. One, that a tripartite arbitration board be formed 1 year prior to contract expiration in the given industry. That this board shall consist of 1 member from labor, 1 member from management, and 1/3 impartial member. Now, to obtain this 3rd impartial member, we're going to have the American Arbitration Association draw up a list containing an odd number of qualified personnel. Then, through a process of labor and management, alternately crossing off the names on this list, the sole remaining name shall be that 3rd party. Secondly, this board shall sit in on all negotiations, acting in a mediation capacity. Third, if labor and management are unable to resolve the dispute without recourse to strike or lockout, the remaining portions of the contract still unsettled will be turned over to the board for a binding decision. Fourth, labor and management shall jointly share the cost of arbitration. All right, what about standards to direct the actions of this arbitration board? 1, no further curtailment of production as a result of labor management disputes. Number 2, the elimination of all unnecessary restrictive work rules. And number 3, all compensation increases are to be determined on the ability of the management to pay and, indeed, for the need of the worker. Now, the question arises, can the affirmative plan meet its needs? Lynn and I feel that it most definitely can. In that first area, we indicted the system as being ineffective in principle, the imbalance of power between labor and management. By making available the terminal facility of impartial arbitration, we can prevent either side from exploiting an advantage during the negotiation. In that second area, that the system is faulty in structure. Here we indicted the existing multiplicity of labor legislation. By simply establishing a consistent national policy, we can alleviate this problem. And finally, that the system represents a failure in its application. Once again, the availability of impartial arbitration prevents either side from exploiting an advantage, thus eliminating a harm to labor and a harm to management. So I think you can see that there is a significant and inherent reason to change the present system, and that the affirmative plan would provide both a workable and feasible approach. Thank you.
Is it your contention that wages should be tied to the average nationwide increase in productivity of 3.2?
Not at all, sir.
You feel then we should adjust these wage increases to the particular industry's productivity average?
Most definitely.
All right. Are you aware that the automobile industry productivity average justified the wage of 5%?
That was not our point on that particular indictment, simply that the procedure today specifies that wages shall not go above 3.2%. Our indictment is that selective government enforcement of existing procedures is infringing on our rights.
All right. If they don't enforce where no enforcement is needed, then they're not being selective, are they?
Well, excuse me, sir, once again, the procedure is existent today. They are selectively enforcing it.
All right. There is no law that says 3.2.
Yes, sir. This is merely a procedure that is adopted under the present system.
All right.
Council of Economic Advisors.
They wish to use it where it is applicable and only where it is applicable, correct?
Well, they claimed that it was applicable to all industries. That's the point.
You told us that Works said that there was much duplication in this 1964 airline strike. Now, did Works actually come to the conclusion that this duplication was unnecessary and bad?
He made the comment that it was wholly unsatisfactory and inefficient.
All right. Now, what does Works think about compulsory arbitration?
Well, I believe he is opposed to it because he likes the system of collective bargaining. However, he has acknowledged that it does have distinct failings.
But he thinks collective bargaining is even worse. Compulsory arbitration is even worse.
Well, his basic point is that compulsory arbitration would destroy free collective bargaining.
In other words, he said that the present situation is bad, but compulsory arbitration is worse.
That's his personal opinion, yes.
Okay. Now, you're stopping, under your plan, strikes over new contracts, correct? When the contract expires.
We're stopping any curtailment of production as a result of a labor management dispute in the basic industry.
Well, now, you stated specifically that you were going to initiate your arbitration board, I believe it was a year, 3 months or something before the contract expires. Now, does this mean you're going to stop any strike, whether that strike is over a new contract or not?
We're going to stop any dispute or strike, as you may call it, over the contents of any contract or grievance as it may be in the situation.
Anywhere in the basic industry.
Right.
Okay. Are you going to arbitrate disputes which tend to be unbalanced, but where no strike occurs?
Well, once again, it's a situation, if it is imbalanced, the side that is weaker would probably take it to arbitration unless they got an adequate settlement under collective bargaining.
Well, how are they going to take it to arbitration if you can only arbitrate when there's a strike?
Well, they'll simply hold out until they threaten a strike until the contract expires, then the board automatically takes over.
Okay. Richard and I will now have 2 consecutive speeches of negative refutation. In this time, I would like to levy 7 objections against the affirmative plan. Richard will then, in rebuttal time, review the arguments against the need for a change. In analyzing the affirmative plan, the first thing we need to take into consideration is that the people involved in the affirmative plan simply do not want the affirmative plan. The people who the affirmative team are setting out to help don't want to be helped. Now remember, the purpose of their plan is to aid labor, to aid management, and to aid everyone who seems to think they are hurt. But yet labor, management, and the government, the people who are going to have to administer this program, have told the nation time and time again that they simply do not want compulsory arbitration. Even their own authority, which they use solely to establish one of their points, Mr. Works in his duplication of the present system, contends that compulsory arbitration is much, much worse, even though the present system is far from perfect. Therefore, our first objection is simply the people involved don't want it, they don't think they need it, they think it's bad. The second objection against the affirmative plan is that they cannot solve their need for a change. They cannot solve their need for a change because they cannot ever completely stop strikes. And remember, when the affirmative team presents a needs case, a case which advocates a need for a change from the present system, they must contend that their plan will be workable in almost every situation and 100% of the time. But yet their plan will simply prove unenforceable. Remember, they're taking away the entirety of free collective bargaining. The effect upon labor in this country would be preposterous, and the effect upon management would be very great also. Their plan would prove unenforceable. Our second objection was documented by looking at collective bargaining in the basic steel industry, the Labor Department report of the 1959 steel strike. Both penal and monetary penalties for violation of compulsory arbitration orders have been enacted, but no jurisdiction has found it practically or politically expedient to enforce either. The universal experience, both in the United States and abroad, is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to enforce the award if one or the other of the parties chooses not to accept it. We can see very definitely that these parties are going to be discontented with a program of compulsory arbitration. This brings us now to the third objection against the affirmative plan. Remember, the affirmative plan is condemning in places production and time lost by strikes and work stoppages. But yet a plan of compulsory arbitration would initiate something just as detrimental to the production and continuous production in the United States. Compulsory arbitration tends to spawn discontentment among workers, and therefore we come to the problem of the slowdown, discontentment among workers. John T. Dunlap, chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard, would tell us, in the absence of an overt strike precluded by law, there is infinite variety of pressures and protests which an imaginative workforce can use to reflect displeasure and resentment. He goes through a bunch of these protests and then comes to the conclusion. The strike in detail may be as effective as the mass stoppage. Therefore, they're actually initiating something, inspiring something in the form of the slowdown, which is going to be just as harmful as what they have already condemned under the status quo. This idea was also concurred with by Clark Kerr, professor of industrial relations and president of the University of California at Berkeley. He goes through a genuine list, a considerably long list, of devices and slowdowns which laborers can use to reflect dissatisfaction if they don't like the arbitration award. He too comes to the conclusion. If they are sufficiently ingenious, they can always slow down operations legally, and if this is done by enough employees, it will have the same effect as an actual strike. So very definitely, they're actually encouraging something which would have the same effect as what they are condemning. We come then to the fourth objection against the affirmative plan. This objection is in the area of feather bedding. Now remember, they're going to eliminate feather bedding. Richard and I have a two-pronged objection here. First, it's almost impossible to eliminate feather bedding. That is because feather bedding is undefinable and undetectable. Feather bedding has been illegal due to the Taft-Hartley Act, but yet the courts have come to interpret feather bedding so narrowly that it's almost impossible to do away with what some people consider to be feather bedding because other people will not consider it such. Herbert Northrup, professor of industry at the University of Pennsylvania, would tell us, to be sure, extreme cases are easily detected. But legislation, however, would have to leave extraordinary discretion to a government bureau. To do its job, the bureau would be compelled to pass judgment on a variety of labor relations matters and would thus end up regulating industrial relations to a degree which neither labor, business, nor the public would find desirable. Therefore, we find that to control feather bedding would mean to control almost the entire industry. We find it's very hard to define such. The second attack against the area of controlling feather bedding is that here, once again, the affirmative team is spawning something which they have already condemned. Once again, Mr. Northrup tells us, Restrictions of output on the part of labor organizations is only one type of such restriction in the economy. Many businessmen restrict output in order to keep prices high. Numerous professional societies have urged enactment of legislation which would permit only licensed personnel to pursue a profession, and this has come true in many instances. Farmers continually restrict production, plow under crops, let fruit rot on the trees in order to bolster prices. Should labor restrictions be regulated and others left alone, equality of treatment under law would seem to require that all groups be equally affected or unaffected by legislation. Not only is this true according to Mr. Northrop, this was one of the basic tenets of the affirmative case, that the federal government must be consistent in their enforcement. Now, if the affirmative team adopted a feather bedding law, it would be a law. Here, the federal government would be inconsistent under a law. Under the present time, they're inconsistent on a policy which is not enforceable, a policy which is entirely voluntary. So definitely the affirmative team is inspiring to a greater degree something they have already condemned. Then we feel that the members of the opposition are having the wrong people do their job. Remember, they told us that the final arbitration would be done in essence by members of the American Arbitration Association. Now, Richard and I admit that the American Arbitration Association has been doing arbitration for a number of years. They've been doing a satisfactory job of voluntary contract interpretation arbitration. However, if you place the American Arbitration Association in a position to actually write the contracts, they themselves feel unqualified. Wayne Quinlan, regional arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association and professor of law at Oklahoma City University, tells us, members of the American Arbitration Association are trained and experienced in interpreting contracts already written. They are not prepared or qualified to actually determine the terms of a contract. So very definitely the people whom they are empowering to do their arbitration are not qualified, not willing, and not ready. This brings us to the seventh objection against the affirmative plan. That is simply that if strikes were ever to become harmful to the third parties, to the nation, or to the parties involved, and if the President of the United States ever felt that the safety of the United States were imperiled, we have methods within the status quo to stop these strikes if we ever choose to use them. We can look first to the Taft-Hartley law and see that according to the New York Times, November 16, 1959, that most legal scholars believe that the President could use the injunction twice if he ever thought it was necessary. The reason he hasn't, obviously, he's never thought it's necessary. Perhaps more significant, we can look to what are known as the ad hoc provisions of Taft-Hartley, a Latin phrase meaning toward this specific. Once again, we see that the status quo is adaptable, that the President can go to Congress and ask for what is needed. He's not tied down to a straitjacket of compulsory arbitration as he would be under the affirmative plan. Therefore, we see 7 reasons why the affirmative plan most definitely should not be adopted.
The law in any way prescribe a settlement for labor and management.
No, the Taft-Hartley law realizes the best way to reach a settlement is through voluntary agreement.
And it also prescribes under the Taft-Hartley law that neither side mediation shall not suggest any settlement to labor and management. Is that correct?
Federally imposed mediation. Now, labor and management very often ask for mediators, not from the federal government.
All right, fine. I believe you talked about the possibility of ad hoc legislation.
Yes. What
legislation might you have in mind here?
Well, once again, this would be adaptable to the individual situation. That's the difference between the present plan. This type of legislation could vary greatly.
In other words, we'd enact the law right at the time of the situation rather than having it reserved.
Rather than having a straight law which we cannot vary from, yes.
All right, fine. Now, I believe you told us that the American Arbitration Association felt they themselves were unqualified to write the terms of a contract.
Yes.
Would you reread the quotation that established that?
Members of the American Arbitration Association are trained and experienced in interpreting contracts already written. They are not prepared or qualified to actually determine the terms of a new contract.
Okay, fine. Now, I believe you told us that we can't completely stop strikes, and that indeed compulsory arbitration would spawn discontentment. Is that correct? Now, what form of discontentment would come about? I mean, why would the laborers be discontent?
Well, they don't like the idea that they're having something forced upon them. They're used to settling it voluntarily.
And are they not provided the method of settling it voluntarily under the affirmative plan?
Well, once again, under the affirmative plan, they have no chance to go to the strike, their traditional method to use their voluntary settlement to put any force behind it whatsoever.
In other words,
without the strike, it's nothing.
In other words, labor and management are only satisfied with the contract when they use the strike?
No, they're only satisfied when they realize that they came to an agreement voluntarily. if you remove the strike, there would be no incentive to come to an agreement voluntarily.
Why would there be no incentive?
Well, because all they would have to do is sit around and hope for a better settlement from the government, making ridiculous
Now,
settlements.
didn't you just tell me that labor and management don't like compulsory arbitration, that they find it disadvantageous?
Yes, but there's no contradiction there, because once a law is enacted, they would most certainly go to all means to exploit the law.
In other words, since labor and management dislike compulsory arbitration, feel that it's disadvantageous, they'd still rather go to it than bargain together
They
collectively.
like the idea of free collective bargaining, where they can strike, where they can do what they want. In essence, yes, everyone wants to exploit each thing for his own benefit.
I see that our time is up. Thank you very much.
In defense of the first affirmative contention in this discussion, a second member of the affirmative team said, "Well, you showed us that there is not an overall imbalance of power favoring labor. Now you must show us there is not an overall imbalance of power favoring management. I choose to do this logically in two manners. First of all, logic backed up by facts. Sumner Slichter, the late professor of economics at Harvard, tells us the most usual policy of unions toward technological change is willing acceptance. The only way that the affirmative team told us that unions could be hurt is through automation or technological change. Yet they accept it. That is logic backed up by facts. Now let's take logic backed up by the affirmative case. The affirmative team told you that labor can be hurt. Or rather, that management can be, that labor can be hurt. Now, if management holds the upper hand in all instances and there is an overall balance of power, there's no variance between either labor or management. It's got to be management all the way. Therefore, an affirmative contention must fall if this contention is going to stand. Now, let's go to that second affirmative contention then. The faulty structure of collective bargaining. They said, what about unenforced guidelines? Herein, you'll remember the affirmative team told you there is no direct law at the present time. What would be the way to do it? They say apply productivity for the specific industry. And herein, you're going to determine if the wages are too high. Ladies and gentlemen, let's again take the affirmative example of the automobile industry. Nation magazine, November the 16th to 64 states. There is no greater bargain in the auto industry than assembly line labor at $4 an hour, including fringe benefit costs. It is not the hourly wage that counts, but the unit labor cost, and this has been steadily dropping in the automobile industry. Per unit labor costs are down below productivity, definitely then an application to a specific, using specifics as the affirmative team says we must, tells us there is no need for a change. They then turned to political harms. They said a fact-finding board might be politically influenced. However, let's remember that mediation, conciliation, and arbitration all work independently of fact-finding boards. Even if the affirmative team could find one example within the status quo that is politically biased, they cannot find all of them to be politically biased. Therefore, by using a combination of these and a combination of the non-political ones, the affirmative need is alleviated. They then said, what about the overlapping? Let's turn to the exact words of Mr. Wirtz, the director of the Department of Labor, as he states, Wirtz defended what he called the administration's intervention in collective bargaining as a holding period. Mr. Wirtz favors this overlapping. Now let's go to the last affirmative need for a change. They say failure in application. They said wages are going down. They said, aha, we've got you in your own trap here. We've got to examine the multi-year contract and not just that first-year increase, which was gained by oil and chemical workers. Ladies and gentlemen, let's do what the affirmative team says we must. Let's examine the multi-year contract. The years being 63 to 65. Now remember that wages went up overall 3.6% a year. Now, in the chemical workers, their wages went up 5.6%. The petroleum workers, 3.8%. Each of these above the national average, despite the fact that automation was prevalent within the industry. Therefore, denying the affirmative point that harm results to labor. Going then into management. They said two harms will result. First of all, strikes will occur. Now, I think we've already analyzed the strike situation, the time sequence situation, which showed us that the strike losses were definitely made up. The only affirmative contention, therefore, is that temporary loss. And ladies and gentlemen, the temporary loss is not strong enough to call for such a radical proposal for compulsory arbitration. Secondly, then, they said, well, what about your profit margin? Now, remember, within the general connotation of profit, there are many things included. They never were able to prove to us that expansion did not knock the red thing up there down a notch. Never showed us that automation could not knock it down a notch. Never showed us that reinvestment, secondary investment, advertising, or dividends could not knock it down a notch. And remember, this is an affirmative contention which must be proven in the very next stand. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this last 12 minutes of negative speaking, we've heard a lot of interesting comments. got around to the idea of need, they tell us that automation, while it does eliminate the threat of a strike, in no way forces an exploitation of labor. At one point, you cannot bargain at all effectively without the strike, and at the next point, labor is not going to be harmed even though they did not have the strike. A distinct contradiction. Well, then, they came around to the idea of plan. They said management in a cross-examination period and labor are going to exploit everything they can get their hands on. And then, in the area of need, they said, well, while they may have the balance in one or these other specific industries, the overall balance doesn't matter, and they have not exploited them. We've seen in specific industries that balance has been exploited, and at the same time, the other speaker tells us that they cannot and will not exploit that balance. Two distinct contradictions in the stance of those two negative speakers. Let's go then to the areas of plan and the specific objections he raised. First of all, he said compulsory arbitration is going to destroy, or first of all, labor and management oppose compulsory arbitration. Now, basically, Don and I are going to agree with this. What we're going to say, however, is that this is in no way an indictment of this affirmative plan. We would point out in relation to that second objection, they said that we're going to take away the entirety of collective bargaining. No, ladies and gentlemen, we definitely are not, and the very fact that labor and management do oppose compulsory arbitration is going to strengthen collective bargaining. As Dr. W. Scott Noble pointed out in his book, Labor and Management, both workers and management strongly oppose arbitration by third parties. We'll both agree on that. If this be true, it would seem logical to conclude that both parties would settle as many issues as possible in peaceful bargaining, never allowing them to reach the court or board, unquote. And I think this can be further substantiated by that fifth plan objection, where they said that arbitrators are unqualified, and as such, labor and management aren't going to get adequate settlement. This may be one of the reasons why labor and management oppose compulsory arbitration, and another reason why they're going to use collective bargaining, an advantage of the affirmative plan, and certainly not a problem. Well then, they told us that the slowdown in relation to that third objection could be accomplished legally under the affirmative plan. Don pointed out in presenting that plan that slowdown and curtailment of work production is definitely illegal under this proposal. Now, while in some instances it is legal today to slow down under the affirmative plan, it is definitely illegal. And in the book Labor Union Monopoly, we find that, quote, enforcing such strikes and slowdowns would be a matter of easy legislation and prosecution. No problem there. Well then, how about feather bedding? They said the courts have cut back on the present definitions of feather bedding. Fine, that's one of the reasons why we have such a problem in relation to feather bedding today. Then they say we must be consistent. In one instance, we can't have anti-feather bedding in the basic industries while there's some farm workers leaving some fruit rot on the trees. We point out we are being consistent. We are enforcing against feather bedding in the basic industries. And to prove that that would be effective, we'll turn you to a past example. The railroad arbitration in 1963 and 1964. It was pointed out in Newsweek magazine on May 4th, 1964, that the settlement was a just and fair one, to use the words of President Kennedy at that time. President Johnson. So we see that in all instances that plan is enforceable and definitely one step we should be taking. So we'll turn our attention back to the areas of need. First of all, we pointed out that the status quo was ineffective in principle. Now, they consistently established that we don't have an overall balance. And Don and I aren't going to disagree with that fact. We're speaking of specifics. In each and every basic industry, the balance is on one side or the other, and the fact that while overall it may balance out is totally irrelevant. Then we turn to the idea of the status quo being faulty in structure. Once again, as to this idea of selective enforcement, they said, well, look in the automobile industry. Labor costs are going down. That is totally irrelevant once again. We have a policy which says that labor costs should not exceed 3.2% each year. And that policy is not being enforced. The negative team has never denied that in any instance. We see we do have selective enforcement. This multiplicity of labor legislation does definitely represent a problem, and for these reasons, we contend that that second ideal still stands. So we've seen then a definite need for a change in the plan to solve these problems. I urge you to consider.
As last negative speaker, I feel it's essential I clear up on the affirmative team as continues to be three contradictions in the negative argument. They first told us that there was a contradiction in the fact that automated workers still get wages and that they do not have a strike threat. Well, there's no contradiction here for the simple reason that automated workers do have a strike threat, even though that strike threat be more subtle. Walter Buckingham, professor of economics at the Georgia Institute of Technology, would tell us, there is reason to expect that automation might increase the union's bargaining power. A work stoppage in one section of a plant that is fully integrated by automation can paralyze the entire operation. Automation makes continuous production more imperative, shutdowns more expensive. Business Week, October 2nd, 1965 tells us, in past oil industry strikes, extensively automated major companies have been able to maintain operations at close to capacity by using supervisory employees. On the other hand, there is a cost involved when major companies maintain operations in this way. Pulling engineers and technicians off research jobs to take over production jobs sets back the process. In other words, there was a strike threat. That's why these high wage increases resulted. Then they said, well, why will they exploit compulsory arbitration and not collective bargaining? The reason is because collective bargaining cannot be exploited. The reason is because we've already proved that labor and management on the whole are relatively equal. The members of the opposition have never challenged this. Richard proved it. I feel last affirmative rebuttal is a bit late to show us examples where labor and management are not economically equal. Then thirdly, they said, well, if labor and management dislike compulsory arbitration, why would they rely on it? But once it's initiated, they said that's a contradiction. That's why this is not a contradiction was explained best by Albert Reed, professor of economics at Chicago. Because arbitrators tend to split the difference between the parties. The expectation that there will be arbitration encourages the parties to take and maintain extreme positions and sharply reduces the chance of voluntary settlement. Systems of arbitration tend, therefore, to drift toward the widespread setting of terms of employment by government bodies. Now that we've dealt with the contradictions the affirmative team accused us of, let us look at the arguments against the need for a change in general. First, they talked about collective bargaining principles. Richard established that labor and management on the whole were relatively equal. Then they talked about the structure. They said 3.2 is not equally enforced. Richard and I said this is the reason is because it's only a policy, it's not a law. They enforce it only where it needs to be enforced. Then in politics, they could only show us that fact-finding was politically biased. The other areas were free of politics. In the area of overlapping, Richard pointed out that Mr. Work said this overlapping is good. The members of the opposition must realize their own authority realizes that this overlapping is better than compulsory arbitration. Then in the application, we talked about increases in oil and chemicals. They said, well, first-year increases are not enough. Remember then Richard went to the statistics about real pay in these industries, how much the actual wages of these people will buy them. Let's look to auto workers, one of the automated industries. Their real pay, that is, pay raises minus the increase in the cost of living, gives them an increase of 13.9%. Utility workers, electric and gas workers, in other words, are up 7.4%. Chemical workers' real pay was up 5.6%. Petroleum workers up 3.8%. All these were significant increases, and all they could say was, well, that's not fair because management gets more profit. They said Mr. Kurtz says management gets more profit. He also tells us in the same book the affirmative quoted why he gets more profit, why management needs more profit. The benefits of increased production should also be shared by consumers in the form of lower prices, rather than solely by the workers alone receiving special advantages. Richard also gave you 7 other considerations that management needs to consider. The members of the affirmative team have not yet considered those. Once again, I feel last affirmative rebuttal is too late. Then they talked about how bad all these strikes were. Richard produced the evidence showing you that all those strikes were made up. It was simply a readjustment of the time. There was no actual loss. The members of the affirmative team have not talked about this since Richard presented his evidence. Last, we talked about profit margins. We presented in the Business Week article showing you that General Motors has a 10.3 profit margin. I feel that's a pretty good return on anybody's investment.
Now, in opening this final rebuttal, I think we might clear up that contradiction Lynn first alleged and this chart showing no harm to labor. Recall we pointed out that the strike in those automated industries is a useless weapon. And secondly, we showed you that labor has been exploited because of it. Now, I'm not going to prove it with my own authorities. I'm going to turn to one the gentleman of the negative introduced. Business Week, October 2nd, 1965. Recall we started reading at the point, in past strikes, extensively automated companies have been able to maintain operations at close to capacity. The trouble is, he didn't reach the point just before that. The industry has been prosperous, and the union has bitter memories. In other words, those 7 factors his colleague listed but never applied, indeed didn't cut those margins down very much. The industry has been prosperous, and the union has suffered. Their own source seems to confirm it. All right, what about that second point? That the labor and management will exploit any system. They acknowledge that, so let's apply it right to that first area of need, that the present system is ineffective in principle. Now, we acknowledged overall, yes, labor and management may be balanced. You take in the automated industries, it's management that has the advantage. In the non-automated industries, it's labor. Yes, they might balance out overall. We pointed out that that was not the point. In specific industries, it's a problem, and as the gentlemen themselves acknowledged, in specific industries, there may be an imbalance. They went on to tell you, labor or management will exploit any system they get their hands on. I think, indeed, they have acknowledged the first system is ineffective in principle. All right, what about that second point, that the system is faulty in structure? Here we indicted the multiplicity of labor legislation and procedures, and at no time did the negative team ever take a stand on them. First, selective government enforcement of present policies is infringing on the rights of our citizens. Now they tell us it's a policy and shouldn't necessarily be enforced. The trouble is they can enforce it against labor, and they are enforcing it against management. They never show that management's rights were upheld. Secondly, the postulated government intervention has entangled labor management affairs with political considerations. Well, they said you can combine non-political and political. Well, what does this result? It merely dilutes the effect. As I proved, the effect is significant, and they never bothered to comment on that. And finally, that the lack of a consistent national policy causes an excessive overlapping and duplication of effort. Once again, all Mr. Wirtz said is he defends government intervention into labor management disputes. But he was forced to admit in these instances it was an inefficient and unsatisfactory process. All right, what about that third area? That the present system represents a failure in its application. First, the harm to labor. Well, the gentleman's own source confirms the negative position, or the affirmative position here. Well, what about that second point, a harm to management and the related economy? He said I'd never talked about that concept that lessons were made up in strikes. To the contrary, I pointed out the fallacy in their evidence and showed you significant permanent losses in the dock strike and the transit. And at no time did they ever bother to discuss my evidence. But then they took down the chart which emphasized one of the most significant problems today, and that is the profit margin squeeze. That's right, they took it down and never once discussed all the problems here. Those problems stand undenied by the negative team in today's debate. All right, I think there's a very definite reason to change. Now let's turn to those objections on the plan. One, they tell us that labor and management oppose it. They say, well, this may be, but they'll still go to compulsory arbitration because they'll try to exploit the system. All right, but that's going to prevent harmful settlements. That's going to prevent harmful strikes. Secondly, they said that the arbitrators were unqualified. We pointed out the advantage to this. Labor and management would stay away unless they felt that the arbitration decisions would be equitable. And finally, there were the objections, the fourth and fifth and sixth objections. You note, the last speaker dropped every one of them in light of Lynn's comments. The idea that we couldn't stop slowdowns and strikes. The idea that we couldn't handle feather bedding. He dropped every one of them in light of Lynn's comments. I think most definitely we have established in today's debate a significant and inherent reason to change the present system, and a